Welcome, everybody. It's such a pleasure to see you all tonight. And it's a very special occasion to speak about this book and having finally this book with us, because it has been a very long book in the making, although it could have been gone for so many more years, because it was just constituted to a number of incredibly interesting conversations, which were leading to more interesting conversations, but we had to put a stop somewhere, and that's why we are here tonight. On behalf of Fotogalleriet, welcome to the book launch of Conversations on Photography. When I started working at Fotogalleriet precisely 3 years ago, one of the first tasks from the board at the time, chaired by Espen Gleditsch, who is with us tonight, was the possible completion of a book to position Fotogalleriet and its history. A tremendous amount of work had been done by my predecessor, Stephanie Bonspretter, on the archives, with Martina Petrelli and Silja Leifsdotter. Martina Petrelli has an incisive piece in the book about the archives, as well as an artist, Nihil Vetukatil, who a few years later searched the institutional politics of blackness in the archive, as he defines it. In August 2018, Fotogalleriet had already done some fundraising for such a telling book. As I'm a bookworm, I was excited to excavate and scroll the archives to see what was in there and what was missing. Knowledge is always incredibly personal, as I found out, and we all move with our cultural baggage. The decision to make a book in English had different motivations, mostly driving it outside of its locale, where these histories were already legends. Fotogalleriet's preoccupations have contributed enormously to discussions in the Nordic region and are highly motivated to be locally rooted, but with an incredible international vision. When one looks at the images of Ellesif Vessel, I came across them through the artist Eline Mugos, we see that there is no reason for Ellesif Vessel not to be as recognized as Dorothea Lange. Not only are they contemporaries active in the interwar period, but they equally question gender norms and social rules and share life experiences in a society and a field that was and still is incredibly patriarchal. Dag Alveng and Tom Sandberg, whose international recognition is undeniable, also brought to Norway in the late 1970s a wave of descent into what photography could be. Not by chance here, we also find Marianne Heske as one of the first exhibited artists at Fotogalleriet in 1978, alongside straightforward documentarian photography. Conceptual art was on the rise, and photography was its primary tool, quick, movable, and multipliable. Susanne Osby-Satter spoke to Dag Alveng for the book, and Lotte Knolund with Marianne Heske. Questions that remain central and are unsolved today, such as working hours and life depending on which class we come from, on top of gender division, were part of Ann-Kristin Eck, Work, Don't Wear Yourself Out, an incredible document about women's working life in Sweden in the 1970s, which speaks about universal issues. Moderna Museet curator Anna Tellgren posed questions regarding these images. The particular structures to which several artists and cultural practitioners envisioned Fotogalleriet in 1977 was exceptional. It was motivated by goodwill, and they didn't have any funding at the time. It was motivated by goodwill and a diverse community whose common interest was photography as a free tool of personal expression. I'm glad we could address such preoccupations with Gry Martinsen, among the mothers of Fotogalleriet, through Karen Fosse Rosnes. Paul Hill, professor of Dag Alveng and Tom Sandberg, who is still incredibly active in the UK, spoke with Aaron Schumann about the beginning. He held Fotogalleriet's first exhibition in 1977. These are not local histories, but a testimony to the possibility of imagining institutions, building up a community of peers, and creating a difference of what's immediately available. Tom Sandberg, Doug Alveng, Jamie Parslow, Tom Martinsen, Anne Thurman Nielsen, Vidar Askland, Gry Martinsen, Björn Høyum, Øyvind Agen, Frode Holland, and Per Berstein. These are some of the names we encounter in the growing network and movement of people in Oslo at the time. They pushed for something different. Photography was moving away from the magazine and the newspaper's page, which was not a small move, but demanding the right to the image. Not what was dictated by the outside, but from the mainstream. And as it has been often demonstrated, artists are the best equipped to deal with the irresolvable contradiction which are raised by the interpretation of images or the images that are out there and needs to be reconsidered. I had a conversation with Bente Geving as I was excited to hear more about her exhibition at Fotogalleriet in 1988, which was part of a movement of Sami pride during those years. The following year, in 1989, the Sami parliament would come to life in Norway. The North is intensely codified with a conflicting image, as Anne Hammerstien defines it through the work of Kåre Kivijärvi. A nation is a cultural construction, we learn from Robert Meyer and Helle Siljeholm. Art has been co-opted in such a movement and should become self-critical to understand how it has empowered certain aesthetic positions that continue their perpetration in national museum. Norway, as they say, or Robert Meyer says, is a land of majestic landscapes that was built through the photographic medium. The idea that Norway is a land of majestic landscapes. Gender has been a returning issue of the conversations within this book. The artist's genius doesn't have to go out and buy spaghetti, sentences Shirana Shabazi in conversation with Stephanie von Spretter. Feminism at the intersection of counterculture returns with Liv Brisak interviewing artist and provocateur Lil Ann Chepstow Lusty. Gender identity, recognition, and identification are part of artist Finser Hansen and researcher Michael Ferrero addressing strategies of survival from queer oppression. Gender normativity comes strongly in the work of artist Maria Pazenau and author Björn Hatterud, and migration and friendship form part of a short story by American artist Zane Armstrong, who wrote for the book, and a recent exhibition presented at Fotogalleriet with Elinor Aurora Osgård. Marte Ram Fortun also held two performances which addressed the lack of discursivity when it comes to women artists at Fotogalleriet. She smashed Fotogalleriet's archive against the ceiling. And these preoccupations had already been part of an exhibition by Silja Leifsdottir, What Remains, held in 2017 for the 40th Jubilee of Fotogalleriet, where she denounced, through numbers, the disparity of gender positions in the institution history through a public speech for the opening. What photography can do is also part of a fascinating dialogue between Anne Hjort Gutto and Mike Sperlinger. How can we imagine what photography can be intersects conversations between curator Susan Bright and artist and editor Nina Strand, who navigate the current landscape of photographic production. Speed was also a concern of artist and writer Matthias Waldbakken in conversation with Eivind Furnesvik, and they indirectly touch upon our current ecologies, a theme which is also dear to Susanne Winterling in conversation with Sarah Yazzani. Photography has been about space, though we think we don't deal with that these days, say artists Bjarne Barre and Katrin Opie. As early applications for support reported, the systematization of Fotogalleriet archive and the book that we are presenting today does not cover only a particular institution in a particular region, but forms the very formation of art, photography, and history in this region. Proper recognition of such history, we claim, is yet to come. Fotogalleriet is not a museum, it's a Kunsthalle, and in such perspective, we didn't want to commission the writing of history, but its own writing, maintaining the informality of these conversations, attempting to fill the gaps, to motivate our present for somebody else to take over the writing of such history. I want just to close with a few thanks, which are absolutely due, but a complete list of these thanks is also at the end of the book. Fotogalleriet is a publicly funded foundation, and therefore I want to thank the Royal Norwegian Ministry of Culture, the Norwegian Photographic Fund, and the Oslo municipality for their trust and continuous support. The Arts Council Norway has contributed enormously in these excavations and unveiling of institutional strategies and the institution's life. The book would not have been possible without the Free Tour Foundation and BKH, the Relief Fund for Visual Artists. I want also to thank Kerer Verlag and Hans Kremmen as publisher and designer of the book, and the many people who have worked in the past 3 years on the book. I also need to thank many individual artists and practitioners who supported this book production since its early days, including Dag Albeng, Terje Abusdal, and Tunje Bo Birkeland. This book also wouldn't have been possible without the dedication of managing editors Karen Fosse Rosnes and Åkon Trosset Lillegraven. A special thanks also to my former colleagues Una Matisse Gjerde and Annika Agstrom for crucial editorial discussions around the scope of this publication, and to Camilla von Koppen and Lene and Emilia for tonight's event. But tonight, we have invited 2 guests and colleagues to read the book critically, Vilde Horvei and Grace Tabea Tenga. We'll start with Vilde. Vilde is a journalist, a curator, and an educator. She has worked for numerous art institutions, including curator at the Munch Museum and a lecturer at the Oslo National Academy of the Arts. Welcome, Vilde.
So I got the most impossible mission of them all, to make a selection out of the 20+ texts in this book, whereas 20 of them are conversations, and make a selection out of that to read to you. So I've done my best, and as a start to kick off the impossibility of it all, I went to Silja Leifsdotter's conversation with Håkon Lillegraven, in which she talks about a curatorial project she did at Fotogalleriet as part of the 40th anniversary program called What Remains. And she says, in 2015, I applied to take a master's program in curatorial practice at the University of Bergen. The program is collection-based, and it was possible to follow it alongside my position as coordinator at Fotogalleriet. I applied with the 40th anniversary of Fotogalleriet as my curatorial project after conversation with the then artistic director, Stephanie von Spreta. In the light of Fotogalleriet's 40th anniversary, I wished to research issues connected with representation and communication, combined with the capacity of the photograph to transcend time. In the initial phase of the project, I studied many historical exhibitions and archives, including a generous dose of megalomaniac projects curated by Western white males, which eventually led me to NASA's project with Voyager Golden Records. In 1977, NASA launched the unmanned spacecraft Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 to fetch data about the planets Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Since both craft were to continue into outer space, it was decided to equip them with information about the Earth in the event of their being found at some point by other intelligent beings in the universe. The information, which was encoded on a gold-plated copper disc, contained greetings in 54 different languages, a collection of music by, among others, Bach, Mozart, and Chuck Berry, plus samples of folk music. It also contained various sound recordings, such as the humming of an engine and a baby babbling. Finally, 118 images were chosen, which were then encoded with the rest of the material onto the disk, so that it could be reproduced by eventual non-terrestrial beings. Among the selected images is everything from iconic photographs of newborn children and magnificent natural scenery to such human feats as ascending mountains, killing animals, and constructing tall buildings. In addition, there is a series of images that, at first glance, have a less obvious intention, such as a portrait of a woman in a shopping center and a man grilling food. Back then, Golden Records was criticized for only showing humanity from a positive angle, but perhaps the most obvious problem area is the attempt to represent the whole of Earth civilization via 118 images, and from an American perspective. What kind of story does this selection tell us? And implicitly, what story do the exclusion tell us about the time when the selection was made? Humans have always felt the need to leave traces behind them, but our language is constantly changing. The oldest cave paintings go back 35,000 years, and the 118 photographs out there in outer space are meant to be able to do the same. If you were to choose one image to represent the world/humanity today to an unknown audience 40,000 years from now, what would you choose? On a different note, Nikhil Vetukatil wrote an article called Politics in the Image of Blackness, which is also about what is missing. I'll read a small section of this. The proliferation of information technology has made large data sets and information available to individuals, advertisers, corporations, and governments on an unprecedented scale. Huge amounts of countervailing information are being spun and cycled through official and unofficial channels, as well as legal and illegal images, alternative facts, and fake news, available to anyone with an internet connection, anywhere in the world. It is almost as if, overnight, everyone has gained the potential to confront what Umberto Eco called the anti-library, that vast assortment of knowledge, whether legitimate or illegitimate, that we have not yet encountered. Such a moment would have offered a great opportunity for all of us to be more aware of our ignorance, to widen our gaze and unsettle our assumptions, if we had not instead hastily set off to find justifications and confirmation for biased opinions in order to exercise the power of facts and authority over one another. And because this is the impossible mission, I'm jumping from place to place, and I'm going back to Bente Gjeving's conversation with Antonio Cataldo. Bente Gjeving is a Sami photographer, as presented, and she photographed part of her family back in 1985 of Anna, Inga, and Ellen. And she explains. Ellen was my grandmother. Anna was her younger, and Inga her older sister. They talked Sami together, and they had a strong Sami identity. They'd lived a Sami life, which means speaking the language, eating the food, and wearing the clothes. The mother couldn't speak Norwegian. When my mother, Margit Eleanor, grew up, she was taught by society that she had to be a Norwegian and forget about her Sami roots. She grew up during the time of race research, when they tried to prove that the Sami people were primitive and childish. Norwegian politics against the Sami culture were very strong, and it was done without dignity. You weren't allowed to speak Sami at school, and all you learned was about the Norwegian culture. Near the coast, this politics was even stronger than in Karasjok. There were more Samis living there. Antonio Cataldo asked whether or not Anna, Inga, and Ellen was wearing Sami clothes, in which she responds, no, they wore ordinary dresses. But Anna and Inga had Sami clothes that they used for special occasions and celebrations. Their parents always wore Sami kofta or pesk, which are clothes made of reindeer skin. My great-grandmother sewed all the clothes. I never saw my mother wearing Sami clothes. When she was an adult, she wanted to get a national dress. But she bought a Finnmarksbunad instead of traditional Sami clothes. My mother never denied that she was Sami. She had an inner loyalty and cut off friends who talked badly about the Samis. But it was only when she got Alzheimer's that she started to bring the Sami things into the living room and told people that she was Sami. What you displace and try to forget in your life, you'll remember when you start to forget. I think that an image will always be there in your body and in your mind. And when you start to forget, like my mother did, it comes out. My grandmother forgot the Norwegian language when she became demented. She only talked Sami then. The trouble was that nobody talked Sami in the retirement home where she lived. So photography's relationship to memory is also pointed out by Finn Serk-Hansen, who was a hero of mine, who said, photography obviously has had a role as a tool for memory saving. Family albums and press photos are examples of this. The visual impact of an image can be a trigger for memories, just as smell can provide a strong memory. They can trigger the brain to release past experiences. This is a powerful trait of photography. On questions from Miguel Ferrero, who's a co-founder of Museo Q in Colombia, he says, Ferrero that is, take curator Claire Bello, in the catalogue of the Queer British Art Exhibition, affirms that queerness is an unstable category and can be rooted in particular contextual frameworks. As those frameworks change or knowledge of them is lost, artworks can acquire or lose a queer significance that was not part of their original conception. In 100 years, what framework or idea about your work should never be forgotten by curators and audiences? Finn Serk-Hansen's response, I think the nature of queerness is to change and adapt meaning in different times and cultures. The documented gay culture is relatively new and is only now receiving appreciation and being documented seriously. I think artwork in public spaces like Almgren and Dragset's sculpture, Memorial to Homosexual Persecuted under Nazism in Berlin, is important and powerful. If my work is seen by coming generations as the document of scenes from a time and culture that were outside the mainstream, that would be fine. I hope that it adds history and awareness of past struggles. He receives the questions, social and dating apps have brought a massive widespread use of photography and video. Built-in cameras in mobile phones allow people to register every moment of their lives. Cameras in public spaces capture us everywhere we go. Newborns now have a complete portfolio that parents make available through the web. It seems we no longer have any possibility of existence without a photographic register. Our, good and sometimes bad, memories are constantly saved and reproduced. What are your perceptions of photography today in a world with so much visual information? How do you find a focus? in which he responds, I think the widespread use of photography today has enhanced the interest in photographic art. I still find photography interesting and challenging. I still feel insecure, and I question myself about how to approach the process of making an image. Maybe this is why I don't get bored. A meeting with the young generation made me aware of how the mobile phone camera and apps have influenced their view. I'm working on a project with a young trans person, and she never felt the images looked right. After a while, we found out that her selfies were mirrored, and that was the way she saw herself. She wasn't comfortable with the way my camera captured her in an unmirrored way. From one thing to another, I also wanted to pick up Annie Ortgut's work on Smalvolden from 2004 in a conversation with Mike Sperlinger, which is also this space of impossibility, according to her, in which she has a struggle with photography itself. And she says, I started out as an art photographer, and that work was a response to the feeling that I couldn't really take photographs anymore. I made a project called Modernistic Journey in 2002, which was about the suburbs of Oslo and the architecture there. Then I realized that there's something very problematic about photography in the sense that it always looks nice. Or rather, you can make everything look nice. You can make the disorderly look orderly. You can romanticize disorder. It's very hard to get out of that romanticism. I realized I had to stop photographing. And why she chose the specific place she used in Smalvolden, she says, is very pictorial. It has this mix of forgotten nature, which somehow develops by itself, and small industry, heaps of old cars and tires. It's a typical slope, space left over after planning. The river Alna flows through it, which has been covered over in most of the rest of Groruddalen. So there was also a political side to the choice of this place, because it's the east side of Oslo, which was heavily developed for industry. And you can only find this river now if you really search it out. The work included 2 non-figurative, almost constructivist or brutalist sculptures in concrete lying on the floor. They were a bit topographic, you might say, and I stated that they represented, not directly depicted, but represented 2 different parts of Smalvolden. Then there was a web page that contained photographs, snapshots of me and my friends going on a tour, which I arranged in this area. I guess the statement was that this place can't be pictured. It has to be represented in a different way to capture its specific spirit or characteristics. I'll jump all the way back then. That's my little last minute out. Another favorite, Catherine Opie, in a conversation with Bjarne Bare. Neither needs an introduction. Catherine Opie is talking about, at the time, an upcoming exhibition that she received a Guggenheim Fellowship. She says, it's an exhibition that will be titled Rhetorical Landscapes. It's looking at the relationship between landscape and language and how we look at it in terms of community and what space means to us. I'm very interested in this kind of positioning of language right now, specifically because of the Trump administration. The pictures in rhetorical landscapes are all images taken throughout the South, swamps, but they're really pristine, not out-of-focus landscapes like the previous body of work, not using abstraction. They hover on the edge of the incredibly beautiful landscapes that one would think of in terms of National Geographic, but I use a depth of field in a certain way, so they're not out of that 8x10 large format school of landscape. So I'm hovering between this place of professional and amateur in these landscapes. Then, included along with it, is a brand new body of work that's a conversation with my film, The Modernist, where the character begins to collage his artworks as he's burning down the utopic modernist houses of LA. I've now collected a cross-section of different American magazines, from Country Living to American Gun to leftist magazines, all contemporary, all in the last 2 years, and I'm collaging them. I'm really interested in how I can still cut images out of a magazine, even though most of us are scanning our phones for information. I think it's a really interesting time in terms of what photography does. There's a certain nostalgia about what the medium can do in creating history, but at the same time, print is going to disappear, just as swamps will disappear. They'll be underwater, and that's why I gave the project the title, Rhetorical Landscape. What is a landscape? Is it a place that we inhabit symbolically in terms of looking at the politics of our time? Or is it an actual physical place? We don't know how to deal with space these days. Photography has been so much about space, but now we're always navigating between a screen world and a real physical world, and that's a fascinating state to me. Bjarne Barre asks, so fascinating and so abstract. I wanted to ask you, since you began teaching in the late 1980s, how do you feel the medium has changed? I know it's a big question. Catherine Opie answers, that is a big question. One of the things I think is so interesting is how art gets framed during different periods of time. Especially being part of academia for over 30 years now, I'm fascinated when people make these declarative statements like, oh, painting is dead. Oh, photography is in a crisis. There are always these kinds of declarations that uphold a kind of theoretical position on the medium at the time. I remember reading the obituary after Robert Frank died, where he was quoted as saying very much what Cartier-Bresson had said, which was, there are too many images. But you can go back to 1920, and people were saying there were too many images even then. So, I actually say that we don't have too many images. There's still nothing that serves us in terms of how we create history, in my mind, better than a lens-based practice. That moment when we click the trigger of the camera and it captures something is forever part of the history of language. And it's the same way that I love digging into the archives at the Los Angeles Public Library or other archives. I wouldn't have wanted to be a photographer if it wasn't for the photographs that Heinz made in the Carolina Mills. What I like is that the medium right now is highly discursive without being overwrought in relationship to the examination of the medium as it was throughout the 1980s and 90s. We had such a rich period of writing on photography during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, from Susan Sontag to Alan Sekula to Martha Rosler to Douglas Crimp. I could keep naming the names. And October contributed so much. But right now, you have this flux where nobody really wants to make definitive statements about the medium because we're all watching to see how people are maneuvering through its rich history right now. I feel like that's the state of photography and how I think about it at this moment in time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vilde, for this amazing reading. And as a note, I think it's also important to say that when Bjarne and Catherine Opie had this conversation, it was long before we imagined or we were so immersed into screen and we thought that physicality was still there. So I think it's an important note to your last reading. I want to introduce now Grace Tabea Tenga. Grace is a journalist and activist, a writer and an art critic, and I'm very excited to hear your reading of this book. Welcome.
So nice to see you all. Let me just see if I got all my stuff. Is this? Yes. Okay. I don't think I have internet connection, but we'll try as much as I can. Thank you so much all for being here in attendance. I remember meeting Antonio earlier this summer, and he gave me this big book of photography, and I was so excited to read it. And I was looking for it, I'm like, but where are the pictures? Because I remember it being so much text. But I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I'm just thinking now, as a critic, we tend to write way better than we speak, so I hope I will be somewhat coherent today when I talk about the impressions that he gave me and whatnot. But I just wanted to start off with this quote, so it segues very nicely from Vilde's reading. But this sentence really sparked a reaction in me, that there were too many images, even in the 1920s. And I just imagine that, to me, this sort of like encapsulates maybe the privileged gaze, or the people who are fortunate enough to have had enough pictures in the 1920s. Because I think maybe from a black perspective, from a queer perspective, from a women's perspectives, there were certainly not enough pictures of various different groups at this time. So therefore, I decided to have a sort of power dynamics analysis of the book. And I enjoyed very thoroughly all of the ways it dissected class, race, gender, sexuality, and how these oppressive systems still continue today and impact the art space as well as photography. And I also enjoyed Nikhil Vetukotil's text, and in particular this quote, "Photography as an artistic practice cannot easily be extradited from its wider practice in society." And I think about the ways that in the art space, there's a representation of certain bodies whereas others are excluded. And I think this also speaks very well to Finn Sørk-Hansen's quote, "Art can represent a collective memory, true or false." And Antonia's as well, had to add you as well there. "Some bodies are granted an existence for posterity, while others become invisible." So I enjoy that the book had this critical perspective on these issues. And the image that came to mind, we're talking about photography, so I really want to find a photograph, but I have to go with this painting. My apologies. But it speaks so much to me. It's called Beyond the Myth of Benevolence. I don't know if you can see. Am I in the way? I can move. Okay, Beyond the Myth of Benevolence by Titus Kaifar, an African-American painter. And this is a portrait which has been dismantled by Thomas Jefferson, who was the third American president and also one of the writers of the Emancipation Proclamation. And what I really find very striking about this painting is that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, which said that all men are created equal. But what is maybe not so much known and discussed about Thomas Jefferson's legacy is that he owned 600 enslaved people, and would by today's standard be a multimillionaire, if not a billionaire, due to his wealth. So the woman behind here is not named. Some people assume it is Sally Hemings, one of Jefferson's enslaved women, but we don't know. But I enjoyed this imagery because it looks at the ways who gets to be acknowledged, who gets to be in front of the lens, who gets to be defined, who gets to be remembered, and who gets to be forgotten. So that's why I really enjoyed this painting, and I thought it really spoke to the things we discuss, or the things that the book discusses. Let me see. So, Bente Gjeving's conversation was really interesting, and particularly in the situation that we are in Norway with our relation to the Sami community or to Sapmi land. And we praise ourselves as being people we are very for indigenous rights, and we have signed we have incorporated the codes or the rights of indigenous people from the UN into our code of law. But we still see many instances of Sami oppression, which is past, which you can see with these three women, but also Sami oppression, which is present. As we're speaking today, there are people demonstrating at Repparfjorden, which is a place where they are planning. The Norwegian government has decided to turn it into basically a trash can, whereas the Sami people heavily rely on it for fishing and for continuing their way of living. So this is a relation that is past, but still very much seeps into today. And I really enjoyed this text and this image And I sort of got this idea of indigenous women bodies as archives. If I had time, I would have added living archives who have preserved their language, their culture, their identity in instances where that is not particularly allowed. And I found it very interesting to have the sort of Varanger perspective as well, because usually when we think of Sami identity, we localize it to Kautokeino or to Karasjok, and we kind of forget the wide scope of Sápmi and how much actually land has been extradited from the Sápmi people to Norway through its colonization. And I thought in particularly of how when they said that they were not allowed to speak their language, and how they had to find ways or they could communicate only when they were in three, they would speak Sami. But the moment another person would enter, they would transfer into Norwegian. And how that the presence of one Norwegian changes the whole setting. And I think about the same, does anybody here speak French? Yeah? So in French, if you have the plural, if there are three women in an area, you say elle, like the plural form of women. But the moment a man enters, you have to switch to the male form to adapt to the dominant group. So I thought of this in the same way as how when the dominant group enters, suddenly the other voices or the other people who are there have to adapt to accustom to that one Norwegian person. So 3 Sami women have to adapt to Norwegian. 3 women, 1 man enters, you have to use the masculine version. So I really enjoyed this analysis or this encapsulating of archival work. And then when I saw this image, I thought of this image. Is it moving or, hello? No, move too fast. There we go. I thought of this image as well, or this video as well. And this is a photo done from the BBC. The woman at the center, her name is Umua Katrina Esau. She is the last speaker of the indigenous language of South Africa, which is called New. And she has worked, the last 10 years, she has worked tirelessly trying to maintain her language and speak it a lot and try to make it survive. But this is her with her 3 sisters. And they speak New, but they have unfortunately passed. So she's the remaining one. So I saw the parallel between these two of how women's bodies have become this sort of and not just bodies, but also minds, has become the center of what connects us from our modern day colonial state to our pre-colonial indigenous state, if that makes any sense. But I got really caught up in this idea of archives and who gets to be documented and who gets to disappear in posterity. And here are clearly 2 sets of sisters who are fighting to remain in posterity, which I'm very happy that they're doing. So let me continue. Yes. So I really, really enjoyed Lena and Chepstow-Lusty's work in this book, and I enjoyed the quote, "I'd like my future label to be untitled." And especially in a time where we are discussing gender identity more and also challenging the normative ways in which gender is represented and wanting to extend those boundaries or extend the gender binary of male and female into other forms of being gender or not opting for gender. I really enjoyed this work. And from the left, you can see Bold from Women Images of Men by Lena Chepstow-Lusty. And it sort of subverts the power dynamics of how we tend to see people in nude. I think of particularly as Leland says, that in advertisement, the way the young female body is used to sell things or used to entice people into, or to entice attention. I really enjoyed this opposition with an older man who doesn't fit the narrative of what we see commercially. But I really enjoy this subverting of power. Who is the one being seen? Who is the one seeing? So I really, really thought that to be interesting. And then also with the female, the female, my bad, to the right, which also forces us to not take these binaries for granted, and also the ways in which we can operate around them, without them, or within them. But we don't have to remain entrapped by it. So I enjoy this sort of play with the gender binary and also living beyond it. So, and I thought that very continued very well with the Untitled, as well as we know many works of art tend to be named Untitled if we don't want to maybe fit it into a particular ramme. What's that in English? Yeah, thank you. Into a particular frame. So I enjoy this idea of Untitled as objecting labels or shoving them away or not accepting the labels that are handed out to us. So found that to be really, really interesting as well. Let me see. Where is? Yes. So I thought, as well as I thought a lot about the writing of bell hooks in reading this, and particularly her book Black Looks, Race and Representation, and about the power in looking, and how photography has a very particular gaze, or has had a very particular gaze, and how that is reproduced. In Nikhil Vetukati's text, he writes extensively about how in the Fotogalleriet's long 40-year history, there were many times black bodies were in front of the lens, so they were represented in the Gambia or in other parts of the world, but they were really behind the lens. So the narrative that they was portrayed was not decided by the people who were being portrayed. So I enjoyed this this understanding of how who we assume is looking is also very much in control of what is being seen. And I thought about bell hook's phrase, the oppositional gaze, and how a lot of the times in photography, the assumed looker is a white male. That's what she wrote, but I would also add maybe a cishet male, a man who identifies with the gender he was assigned at birth, and also a man who happens to be heterosexual, is the same assumed looker of society. So a lot of our imagery tends to reflect that perspective, or is catering to that perspective. But then the black female gaze becomes an oppositional gaze, a gaze which subverts or challenges or maybe sees different things that maybe this gaze misses because of its blind spots. So I've thought a lot about how this book dances on between the oppositional gaze, the dominant gaze, who gets to get seen, who gets not to get seen, and so forth. And the last slide. Yes. So, in reference to the first quote, if the world is full of images, what is left to be unseen? What have we not seen yet? What have we not managed to encapsulate with our cameras? What is it that we need to see more of? And I found it so I thought of, since the book was called Conversations on Photography, I tried to find pictures that are sort of in conversation with each other. So I enjoyed this photo by Finn Sirk Hansen and this photograph by Zanele Muhale, South African photographer, and how they sort of speak to elements of... we have seen maybe images that are similar to this, but because of the different gender dynamics, which is outside a heteronormative lens, it becomes something different or something that we need to see more of, I would argue, because it's still so underrepresented. So, and these are works that are from, I think, 30 years apart, but still, there's still a lot of connections to be made here, or to be, there's still whatchamacallit? I need to think, sorry. Yes, so there is still a continuation of exclusion, even though we're trying to move away, and I think this was an attempt to move away from the dominant structures or the status quo. There still is a long line that needs to, we still definitely need more perspectives that are not represented by the status quo, if that makes sense. Yeah, I think that was it. Thank you so much. I can leave it. I can just leave it like this, actually.
Thank you so much, Grace, for such a run through, and also, for having continued this conversation by building new references, also for us to continue to think about how the book can develop in the future. If you don't have a copy of the book, I invite you to get one outside. Otherwise, we continue with the evening because the Photo Book Festival Oslo opens today, curated by Zofia Cheblowska. And at 6 p.m., it started at the Arbeidssamfunn Plus. And at 7 p.m., you can have a glass of wine and also see the exhibition of the Photo Book Festival Oslo at Fotogalleriet. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for having that is here, that has contributed to the book. I also want to thank you publicly because it has been such a tremendous journey. And thank you, everybody, for being with us tonight. Thank you.